about a new secular religion in America that said that your achievements could be capped by the genetically inherited attributes that you inherit on the day you're born, that business needs to take into account the work of politics such that the private sector perpetuates political dogmas that are best left to the politics. I decided to then step aside and write a series of books. I wrote a book called Woke Inc., a book called Nation of Victims, another one called, most recently, Capitalist Punishment. I started a business called Strive, whose mission was to depoliticize corporate America, something that I had seen firsthand. But I realized that a deeper problem in our country actually started not from necessarily even the government. And, I'm a conservative. Many conservatives rail against big government. I'm one of them. But I think the deeper problem was a cultural failure in our country, where we have actually lost our sense of national identity itself. And I'm a millennial. I'm 37 years old. I'm the first millennial ever to run for US president as a Republican. But I think there's something that's true about our generation. I'm looking around this virtual room that's probably true for many of us in the same generation. If you ask somebody our age, what does it mean to be an American? You get a blank stare in response. It's a deer in the headlights kind of moment. And I think that's a regret. I think that's a vacuum of identity at the heart of our national soul. And when you have a vacuum that runs that deep, that's really when poison begins to fill the void. And so I think we have an opportunity in our country right now to answer that question. What does it mean to be an American today? I think that's the toughest question we're going to answer in our generation. I'm an America First conservative, but as I often say, to put America first, we have to rediscover what America is. And I think that's the movement I'm looking to lead through this campaign. This is not just a presidential political campaign. It's a cultural movement to answer what it means to be a citizen of this country, to move beyond just celebrating the diversity of our attributes, the different shades of melanin, the different genders, sexualities that we may each inherit on the day we're born or come to adopt later in life. We're more than those characteristics. I think that I'm running on a somewhat controversial premise in this campaign, that diversity is actually not our strength, that our strength is actually what unites us across our diversity, the ideals that set a country into motion, the ideals that, frankly, many of us and our parents and our grandparents lived and embraced in coming to this country and succeeding through ideals like merit, like the unapologetic pursuit of excellence, like hard work and commitment, like being grounded in a family that's the best known governing institution to mankind, two parents in the house that actually push their kids to do more and succeed at a greater scale than they did themselves. That's the American dream that many of us and our families and our parents breathed into this country as new lifeblood that once kept this country fresh. I think that that's the lifeblood we need to breathe into our country again, is reviving those ideals that set the country into motion 250 years ago, those ideals that immigrants traveled oceans to actually be a part of in this nation. That's a big part of what I think we can revive, that we need to revive as we find our way in the middle of this national identity crisis that we're in. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I don't think we're a nation that has to be in an inevitable national decline. I think the way I look at it is we're just a little young, going through our own teenage years, our version of adolescence, still figuring out who we're really going to be when we grow up. It's not going to happen automatically. It's going to happen because those of us here in this country stand up for what the country actually stands for. And you know what? I think that one of the ways we do it is by starting to talk openly again. And I'll wrap my opening, unstructured monologue here with a reflection on how I think we can take the first step towards reviving the country, is just by starting to talk openly again. I think that most of us in America, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our partisan affiliation, share the basic commitments in common, basic commitments to ideas like free speech and open debate and self-governance and the rule of law and, yes, meritocracy, which I referred to earlier. I think most of us agree on these basic rules of the road. I think most of us probably think that our neighbors do too, but we're not sure anymore because we don't feel free to talk about it. And so I think if we're free to start talking openly again, what we're going to discover is that most of us share those basic principles in common. Fear has become somewhat infectious in our culture. Fear spreads. It's spreads faster than COVID in 360 degrees. Fear is infectious, but I think that courage can be contagious too. And I just think that requires more of us to start talking openly again. And frankly, that's why I love forums like this one, where we probably have people with diverse political affiliations, and that's a good thing. We don't have those conversations across partisan silos very much anymore in this country. I'm looking to change that. The only way we do it is by starting to talk openly again. And hopefully in the next 15, 20 minutes that we have, we can take some questions where we do, again, in a way that's unafraid, in a way that's uninhibited, start to actually have open conversations again in this country. And once we're able to start doing that, I think we close this gap between what people are willing to say in public and what people are willing to say in private. And if you want my answer to what the best measure of the health of American democracy it is that gap. The gap between what you'll say in public, the gap between what you'll say in private. Once we close that gap, I think we revive our national soul. That's why I'm in this race, and that's why I'm looking forward to talking to you guys tonight. So thanks for having me, and let's make this a little bit more of a conversation.
Great. Vivek, thank you so much for those illuminating remarks. And maybe I can kick this off with a question for you.
Sure.
You brought about this gap between, what we think privately and what we say publicly. Is that what led you to write the book on wokeism? And can you tell us what went through your mind when you did that and why you did it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very open book with you guys about it. Actually, it was a first personal experience that I had as CEO. So I had, built a biotech company from scratch. It was by that point a multi-billion-dollar company in 2020, and the George Floyd death triggered a lot of protests across this country, Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, that demanded that a CEO, prominent position or whatever, the position that I was in, make a statement that supported Black Lives Matter as an organization, as a movement. And I actually couldn't in good conscience bring myself to do it. I keep an open mind, but one of the things that really was the decider for me is that this was an organization that at the time had on its website that one of its objectives was to call for the dismantling of the nuclear family structure. And that didn't make much sense to me. I had actually gone to a racially diverse public school, 1st through 8th grade. And I'll tell you something from my experience. There wasn't a single one of those black kids that couldn't have achieved everything that I have in my life if they had also been given the same 2-parent household with a focus on education that I had been given. People use the word privilege a lot. Like probably many of you, I didn't grow up in money, but I did have the privilege of having 2 parents in the house with a focus on education. And so for me anyway, I couldn't in good conscience say something artificial that was positive about an organization that called for supposedly advancing Black lives by calling for dismantling the nuclear family structure. And so I refused to do that. That led to a series of events that I described in my book, but which put me in the position of having to make a choice. Either I could mostly speak my mind most of the time, but speak through the filter of corporate self-interest when push came to shove, or that I could actually speak my mind openly as a citizen. And so, yes, I think to answer your question, I made the latter choice. I decided to separate my voice from that of the company, which the company was in a good place. There was a good successor ready to take my place, who, by the way, had completely different political viewpoints than I did. It didn't matter. We were building a biotech company that developed medicines. And then I decided then to write Woke Inc., traveled the country, took a lot of that feedback to write my second book, which was Nation of Victims, talked about the spread of victimhood culture in America, called for the revival of excellence and the unapologetic pursuit of excellence as the heart of an American identity that I still think we can revive. And one thing led to another that eventually brought me to the doorstep of, I think, a presidential campaign that really hopes to spread these values at a grassroots level in a way that does for America in the year 2024 what Ronald Reagan did in 1980, which was to actually lead a national revival. And that's ultimately now what I'm in this race to do.
Thank you. Sanjeev, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, MR. And Vivek, we really appreciate your openness and willingness to engage in dialogue. That really makes it so much more interesting and gives us a chance to learn more about your candidacy, about what drives you and so forth. So that's fantastic. I, like a lot of other Indian Americans and people outside the Indian American community, I've been following your campaign, and there's probably 20 questions I could ask you, but I won't do that because I know that we are itching for dialogue, and there's a lot of people waiting here to ask you questions. So, like MR was saying at the outset, we do have an international audience, and I'd like to start by welcoming to ask a question a young social entrepreneur and a CEO from Brisbane, Australia, in Queensland, Taj Pabari.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and g'day, Vivek. I'm actually sitting on the couch right now because I broke my foot, so I don't usually take video calls sitting on the couch, but it's good to meet you. I'm curious, having read a lot of your work and enjoyed a lot of your Twitter commentary. Obviously, young people more broadly are a more socially conscious generation. They are far more equipped to, and I guess more broadly, will be voting for, I guess, a more progressive side of politics. I love your energy. I think that's the energy that your country certainly needs. How do you get young people to actually buy into what you're talking about?
Well, I think that young people are hungry for purpose and meaning in the country right now. I think we've taught them to go to Ben & Jerry's and order their cup of ice cream and put some social justice sprinkles on top to satisfy what is, I think, a deeper moral hunger for something more substantial. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is not just eviscerate the hypocrisies of the left in America. I've done some of that for sure. But I think we're now looking to take this to the next level, to actually fill that hunger for purpose with something more meaningful, right? With a belief in something bigger than ourselves. And I'm not a preacher, but as a presidential candidate, I can actually do this at least, if not with. There's a room. I think there's a God vacuum in our culture. I do believe that to be true. But as a presidential candidate, I think there's also a national identity vacuum. And I think that the way I'm hopefully going to be able to reach young people across this country is by showing up. I mean, going to college campuses where, frankly, other Republican candidates are saying they won't go because they're afraid of the questions they're going to get. Showing up's half the battle. But then I think speaking to the actual deficit with an affirmative vision of our own. Talk about the revival of individualism, what it means to be an individual rather than surfing some tectonic plate of group identity. Well, what does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to have agency? What does it mean to pursue excellence? What is merit? It's not just anti-woke. It is, what does pro-excellence mean? And I think people are hungry for leadership and vision and direction, running not from something, but running to something. And I think that's, what young people in particular are hungrier for than most. And as the first ever millennial to run for US president as a Republican, as I said, I think I'm not only well positioned, I have a responsibility to do that. And I take that very seriously. And, you look like a young guy yourself. I appreciate that question, especially for the Americans who are on this call. I think you'll be part of that movement with us.
Thank you, Taj, for joining us from Brisbane, and Vivek, thank you. And again, appreciate your willingness and indeed your desire to speak to audiences that people may otherwise shy away in your position. Next, I'd like to go to Sadanand Dhume, who is at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist at the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, nice to meet you. I read your columns. It's great work. Good to meet you this way.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you too. And I have a question about one of a pet issue of yours. I just recently. I watched an excellent podcast with you with Richard Hanania, and where you were speaking about affirmative action. And my question is sort of in a way it's twofold. Could you sort of explain to this audience over here, which, as you said, would probably has people of, with varying political views, shall we say, why the position that you have taken on affirmative action matters for America and also matters for Indian Americans in particular? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think that it matters for America because America is built on meritocracy. We have never fully lived up to that ideal. Now, I also say that our worst hypocrisies as a country are our best evidence that we have ideals at all. Because if you have say what you will about the CCP, you'll never call them hypocrites. I think to be a hypocrite, you had to have ideals. And so we're fallen human beings and we have ideals. By definition, we're going to fall short of them. But at least the vision has always been to aspire towards meritocracy. So I think it's an important part of American identity. I think pragmatically, it's very important for our leadership position in the world. I think that eventually we will be a nation in decline if China is behaving meritocratically in the way that its government or its private sector chooses to hire people in a way that the US is not. I also think it's inherently divisive, affirmative action is, because I think this is one of the lessons you could actually learn from India. This is, many people left India because they were trapped in a system that had a version of affirmative action in the Indian context. That was actually a boon to America. Many of the most talented people came to America in part because there were limitations in how far they could get ahead in a quota-based system in India. Now America's adopting those same quota systems. I don't think it's going to end any better for America either. And so I also think it's inherently divisive in that it doesn't even help the very people it's supposed to help. I think Black Americans, were economically faring better in America in the 1960s. More Black kids born into two-parent households then, by far, than today. After the Lyndon Johnson Great Society Project that actually included many race-based affirmative action programs too, and it teaches Black kids that they can't get ahead but for somebody giving them special aid. And I think it creates unfair anti-Black racism in America, because there's no better way to fuel racism against one group than to take something away from a different group on the basis of their skin color. So it loses on many counts. I think everyone should get behind that vision, regardless of whether or not they're the ones narrowly being penalized by it. Though I do think it is a fact that Indian Americans are among those who are most penalized by it. I think that if you take a look at Harvard's admissions criteria and you blinded it, there's no doubt that Asian Americans, including Indian Americans, have a tougher time getting. I picked Harvard just because that's my alma mater, but it's probably true of most colleges across this country. That you have to earn. I think I wrote in my last book, at least as of my last writing a year and a half ago, it's like over a 400-point differential on the SAT. If you're a Black student versus an Asian American student, it's over 400-point differential for getting in on the basis of all other criteria being held equal. And it's a 1,600-point test where literally the lowest score is 400. So this is drastic stuff, and it's just one example of what you see all the way up the chain. But I don't think the reason that Indian Americans should get behind my agenda be that we're harmed by it and therefore we deserve our take. I think that's a little bit appealing to the wrong instincts, I think. That may be true, but I think the instinct that should cause us to want to end affirmative action is one that has all of us in this together as reviving merit, colorblind merit, as a way that not only makes our country great, but also a way that unites us as a people around a common value that all of us can rally behind. I actually said this in the remarks I gave in the room in New Hampshire here. America was actually derived from Amerigo Vespucci, explorer here, but he was named after his grandfather, whose name was derived from the word Amalric. It's an old Aramaic / Old Gothic word. Amalric. Rick means master. Amal means work. Master of work is almost in the linguistic root of America itself. Merit seems like it fits in that, but merit is, to me, a system where one is able to achieve their maximal potential, whatever their potential is, in whatever area that potential is, that nobody will stop you from achieving that maximal potential you're endowed with. That's what it means to be meritocratic to me. And I think many people come to this country because they believed America was a country where merit thrived. And I think that's part of why all Americans, but Indian Americans included, immigrants included especially, I think should get behind an agenda that rejects race-based quota systems or affirmative action. And by the way, there's something a US president can do. Lyndon Johnson created it by an executive order. I'll end it by executive order. I pushed Trump's people on why they didn't do this. They said it was a political hill they didn't want to die on. I'm not going to be afraid to take this on any more than I'm afraid to take on any other issue. And I think this is one that will actually get done with the stroke of a pen, likely on day one.
Thank you, Sadanand. And Vivek, affirmative action is a big issue in my home state of Virginia. You might have heard of the controversy on both sides of the debate around Thomas Jefferson High School. But speaking of Virginia, let me now invite my fellow resident in Virginia, Srilekha Palle. Srilekha?
Thank you, Sanjeev. Vivek, as Sanjeev said, I'm a Thomas Jefferson parent. I'm actively involved with Governor Youngkin's campaign. In fact, I work as an advisory capacity with Governor Youngkin, Winsome Sears, who is our Lieutenant Governor, and Attorney General. I also was involved with National Merit Scholar, which you already spoke about it in a couple of your podcasts. So we obviously believe in all the principles that you're talking. But my question is about Department of Education elimination that you keep talking about, Vivek, which I think is actually not a bad idea, trust me. But my question is, what is the alternative that you propose? Because I wake up and I hear your podcast. I'm always looking at your what statements you're releasing. I'm listening to your LinkedIn. But my question is, you've never proposed an alternative, even if you have an alternative idea for Department of Education. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about what you have.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's something inherent about the medium of social media. I think it's maybe a character limit, quite literally, but there's something about the medium that is fundamentally at odds with detail and nuance. And so forums like this are better for that, or even live events. And you guys should come join us in New Hampshire or Iowa, or we'll be in Virginia before too long if we're if time flies as quickly as it does. So here's I'll go very fast here on education. I want to shut down the Department of Education, not because I'm anti-education, but because I am pro-education in this country. It's just that I don't think the federal government does a good job when it interferes with local education. So very specifically, that's about 83 to $90 billion a year spent in that department. 25% of that budget could literally put 3 armed security guards in every school across this country. At 1 or even 2, at 1, you don't really necessarily prevent the school shooting problem. At 3, you absolutely do have a significant safeguard against it. So that's just something that's a separate point, unconscionable that we should have school shootings in this country. 3 armed security guards in every school across the country would solve it. That's less than a quarter of the federal Department of Education. Second thing that I would do is use the remainder of that funds to fund underfunded school choice programs across the country. We would more than fill the deficit in even poor and underfunded communities across the country, be about $1.5 billion per state that we would have. That more than fills a gap. School choice is not an end all be all. I believe in public schools also competing with actually the private schools that parents are then empowered to send their children to. The number one constraint on public schools relative to private schools is teachers' unions. I would favor abolishing teachers' unions. I think that's perfectly legitimate because though unions may have a separate debate to be had about private sector unions, if you're a member of a public teachers' union, you are literally unionizing against the public that you supposedly represent. I think that unshackles public schools. I think if you then combine that with transparency, which is all curricula online, cameras in every classroom, now we have a place where parents have enough information to then act on what they see in the public schools to hold them accountable. Public schools are unshackled by teachers' unions. They can actually compete. Underfunded school choices programs are funded by Department of Education that we've shut down at the federal level. Now we actually have a competitive marketplace in education that's actually, by the way, much more equitable in its access that it provides to inner city kids across the country. So I went fast there. There's a lot there. And then the last thing is, part of what the Department of Education does in the US that's, I think, a regret, is that it tilts the scales towards 4-year college education at the expense of vocational training. So make no mistake, I got ahead in part because I did pursue a 4-year college education that I valued greatly. That was a good path for me. Maybe it was a good path for many of us on this call. Our path cannot be the only path. I think it's part of the problem in America is that's been the only path to actual living the American dream, true dignity, et cetera. And, I think that vocational education has been unfairly penalized as college education has been subsidized, and that necessarily tilts the scales away from vocational education. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a substantive perspective on still just scratching the surface, but on my vision for educational revival in our country. And then the last piece of this is putting civic education back. I think that can't happen first. If that happens through the federal government, it lends itself to capture. But But if you actually are doing it in a bottom-up way against the backdrop of true school choice programs across the country without the federal government imposing it top-down, that could actually revive a missing national pride that many Americans are hungry for as well. So I'll take one more question. Before I do, the one thing I wanted to just encourage everybody to do on this call, I would so appreciate it if you did, is just, learn more. I mean, you can actually, we're gonna have a much better website up next week, but we have our one that we launched with that's still up today. You can just go to Vivek2024.com, VIVEK 2024.com. This is a nonprofit, and so this is just not a fundraiser or anything like that, but you can just learn more by going to the website. And in whatever way, one of the things I think we've lost in this country is a sense that you don't have to agree with 100% of what a political officer says. That includes the President of the United States. I think the best we can hope for is that that they're telling you 100% of the time what we actually believe. And so at least that's my commitment in here, is that you won't agree with me 100% of the time. It'd be bizarre if we did. but at least if you know 100% of the time that I'm giving you what I actually believe, I think we at least restore a sense of honesty to this. And so if people, visited the site, it's Vivek2024.com and supported in whatever way you were maximally able to, in whatever format was best for you, we greatly appreciate that. And I'll take one last question before we wrap, and then I'll close it up. But I'm so grateful to have been able to get all of you together in an evening like this. This has already been a lot of fun. And we'll take one final question, and then I'll wrap.
Can I go ahead?
Sanjeev, you're muted. Sanjeev, you're muted.
Yeah, MR, I was going to turn it over to you for a question from one of our members, Avanish Sahai. Do you see that on your screen?
Sorry, Sanjeev, you go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Don't worry about it.
So Sanjeev, can I ask a question, Sanjeev? Can I ask a quick question?
Well, I'd like to go to Avanish's question, actually. And Avanish, I'm reading your question up above. Give me just 1 second. Yes, America has been the leader in innovation and education for the past 150 plus years. However, there seems to be a regressive movement in many parts that question science and the value of education or innovation. COVID vaccination being an obvious example, but also various state-led initiatives to limit exposure to scientific processes and STEM. How do you propose to bring education back to the forefront of what has made America such a leader in innovation and tech? And this is Avanish Sahai from the Bay Area, a senior partner formerly at McKinsey.
Well, thank you for that. Look, I think that part of our innovative culture involves innovative educational systems. I won't repeat my answer to the last question. I think my answer to the last question actually does pave the way for education as a core competitive advantage in this country. But I think part of it is I think we've lost our sense of being daring in this country, right? To be bold. I mean, part of what it means to be America is we're the pioneers, we're the explorers, we're the people who nobody is going to stop from exploring any frontier as far as we can go. Funny fact, even about the founding fathers of this country, is you don't talk about scientific innovation. And Thomas Jefferson, we all know him for writing the Declaration of Independence. Well, it turns out he also invented the swivel chair, right? Benjamin Franklin was a co-signer of the Declaration of Independence. The Franklin stove is named after Benjamin Franklin because he invented it. He actually also invented a treatment for the common cold, something that biotech firms have even today struggled with as a cure to the common cold. An early treatment came from Benjamin Franklin, the bifocal glasses. I mean, the lightning rod in the home. These are guys who, and I bring this up because part of America's founding wasn't just our Constitution or our principles. It was a founding culture. And I think that part of what we've lost, and I think that some of it was baked into that question, and so I believe in open debate. And I think that, so in that spirit, I'll sort of call out part of what I think we're missing is that culture of curiosity, that culture of being daring and ambitious. Today, if Benjamin Franklin said he was going to be the guy who wanted to invent the lightning rod or the Franklin stove, we would say, you're not an expert. You're not trained in that. You're a political person or whatever. You're a theorist who writes books. You're not allowed to do that. I think part of what we actually would benefit from more in our country is taking off those shackles and to revive our self-confidence that we can actually, through our own curiosity, through our own hunger, through our own passion, actually be daring to achieve whatever it is we can achieve in our life. I did this in my career. One of the first medicines I worked on was a drug for Alzheimer's disease. Hardest area for drug development. We failed, fell flat on my face. Well, what did I learn? You can pick yourself up and do it again. And that was the backbone for developing 5 other medicines that are FDA approved products today. So I think that it's not just, reform of the educational system I talked about. Absolutely. I think that localizing education, funding underfunded school choice programs, injecting competitiveness, reviving meritocracy. Look, I think that we need to worry more about the quality of the medicines we develop rather than the skin color or the race of the person who developed them. We need to worry more about actually whether pilots are trained to fly aircrafts rather than whether or not the tests that the pilots have to take result in racially disparate impact in the cockpits. And I'm not making this stuff up, right? This is real world examples. So I think that's part of what we need to revive. But I think part of it also is that we need to revive our culture of being daring, being ambitious, being willing to fail. The path to innovation and success runs through failure, and be willing to embrace that as the founding fathers of this country were. As I think many people who pack their bags and travel across one ocean or two to be part of this country, that involves taking a risk. That's part of what we need to revive in our culture too. And one of the roles of a US president is not just to set policy, but it's to set a cultural tone in the country too. And, I say this as a parent of 2 kids myself. I don't know about all of you, but it's been a long time since I think we could have had a president in the White House who I would look my 2 sons in the eye and tell them in good conscience and in good faith that I want you to grow up to be like him. It's been a little while since I think I could have said, it's not a Republican or Democrat point. I think it cuts across partisan boundaries here. And I think part of, Ronald Reagan may have set that example for the country, but I think part of what we're missing is national leadership that sets a cultural tone for reminding people what's actually possible in our country. And, if you guys do whatever you can in your small part to put me in that position, that's the one way in which I'll tell you that, policies, whatever, we may disagree on this. Some of this requires congressional action. You can't overpromise. But the part I can promise is that I will do my best to set that national example for our next generation and for our kids' generation too. And, I'm so grateful to my parents for the upbringing and the stable foundation they gave me. I think we're trying to give that to our children in our household. But I think if we can set a national example for doing the same thing for kids of any skin color and any background across this country, that's not something that requires Congress to act on. That's something that we can set through the example of leadership itself. And so, in wrapping, I think that I wanted to just introduce, Dhruv, are you on the call? Dhruv Yadav, who just joined our team, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep.
Dhruv's going to work with all of you to stay in touch. This is hopefully the beginning of a conversation that we have. There are many ways to get involved, not just on this campaign, in our national revival, really, is what we're talking about getting involved in. It's bigger than any, political campaign here. I think that's a shared project where each of us will have our role to play. No one's coming from on high to save us. I think if we're going to be saved, it's going to be because we save ourselves and we each do our part. And I'm merely trying to do mine, but I'll ask that we each do each of our parts together. And I think we'll have a country left to be grateful for in America here. So, Dhruv, I'll leave it to you to, anything you want to leave with everybody before we wrap up. But I just want to say my thank you to everybody, and Dhruv will be following up with all of you.
I'll be following up with everyone, and no, it's great to work for someone like Vivek. He means what he says, and he says what he means. So I think that's really important, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you guys.
Well, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Dhruv. This has been a fascinating conversation, Vivek. And just a quick line of acknowledgement for your team, Vivek. I've worked on political campaigns myself in the past, and I know that in addition to the principal, the staff puts in a lot of hard work. So I'm sure that you're very happy for the support of your team. Vivek, this has been outstanding. It's been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. And one thing that I can say is that, one can agree or one can disagree with your views. Everybody has their own political beliefs, their own political persuasions. their own biases or perspectives. And, where you stand on an issue, the saying often goes, depends on where you sit. And that is true of all of us. But one thing that I can say, and which is what you alluded to in the beginning, is that your commitment to dialogue, open dialogue, and the coherence behind your points of view as you see them is something that we should all applaud, and makes us glad that there's an Indian American like you running for president, political affiliations notwithstanding.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you
I
for
so
doing this,
appreciate it.
and good luck as you continue on your bus in New Hampshire.
Thank you. I so appreciate it, guys. Thank you, and
All right. Good
all
luck.
the, all
Thank
the
you,
support
guys.
in the world. I'm grateful for. All the best.
Thank you for all the attendees. I know there were several questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them. I wish we had one more hour with Vivek, but a presidential candidate is on a busy schedule. What can you say?